sync. Hey there everyone. I had previously mentioned about a blank that had been wrecked and been delivered to me snapped in half. And I mentioned it offhand in my previous creating my first surfboard video. 2 blanks that I've ordered because I'm currently shaping another board. They both arrived damaged, definitely worth keeping in mind. I sat around with a blank that was snapped through the middle for quite some time, and I just thought it was a complete write-off. I didn't think that this would be useful at all. I'd only use it just for some color testing, but more or less it just sat around for quite some time. So I thought that was the end of it, until I recently saw Stab's latest video series called S.U.R.F, S-U-R-F, and there was a really cool part where they, under U, I believe it is, they stuck 2 surfboards together again and actually surfed them pretty well. Now some did fail, but I mean some were like amazing, and they glued them together really crudely with not even really proper stuff, and I was impressed. And I thought, hey, you know what? I actually might have a chance here. I want to make a fish surfboard. I have a blank that is lying around gathering dust, and you know what? I want to try merging the 2 together and getting a board out of it. These are the 2 halves. Da-da! A blank snapped in half. That's how it was delivered to me. Shocker. Was a bit bummed by that, and had to get a new one. I have pre-drilled a few holes, and I've put a bit of doweling in. Now they're quite short, I know, but they're quite thick doweling here, just to help guide the 2 blanks together. So I've drilled some holes, popped the doweling in there, and I've got some other holes on the other side. They're ready to go. I'm going to use a bit of Q-cell to fill each plug with the doweling, and then same with the other half, squish them together. Once I got them squished, I reckon I'm gonna run some tape, pretty wide tape, I'm gonna run along the bottom, and then sort of pour in the rest of the Q-cell to fill it out. I'm trying my best not to overfill because I don't want any bulges or anything, because I intend to, of course, shape this into a board. And if I got too much Q-cell, I reckon I'm gonna hit hard spots when blending into the foam, creating some difficulty. So I'm gonna do my best to use as little Q-cell as I can, but still fill it, which might be a bit of a challenge, but we'll see how we go. So anyways, step 1, getting the 2 halves together again. Well, as the rain starts coming down, we'll see. Hopefully it's not too noisy. Otherwise we'll have the beautiful sound of rain behind us. So finished filling and sanding back, and I'm pretty happy with the result actually. So from what you saw before, I actually did a second fill because I wasn't quite happy from that initial join. I had a bit too many gaps. So I've gone through with more Q-cell and filled that up even more, taped the edges there just so I didn't have too much spillover. And yeah, after I did that, I of course I overfilled, and it's just kind of the way it is. So I've just got the sander, gone over those areas, worked them back so that it's relatively level, because I don't want to hit massive bumps with the planer when I get to planing. So I think that's pretty good. Might be a bit hard to see on camera, but I'll do my best. Pretty level, looking good. Also the other side. Nice join. I'm not worried about it being perfect just yet. Gonna plane it, so that should remove any imperfections. Feels quite strong, feels like one blank again now, which is awesome. Pretty happy with the joint, it's straight. I can tell it's maybe just subtly, as in the nose is just subtly too much up. It's not perfectly level, but it's definitely straight, which I'm happy about. Hope that the Q-cell is not going to make any issues sanding later on. That remains to be seen. And what I mean is when I'm shaping the rails or whatever, I'm going to have these harder points that are going to take more effort to sand down than the foam either side. So I'm going to have to be really mindful when working with it. Done my outline, so just sort of go through the frame there, and there's the fishtail. Next step will be sawing out the template. See you again soon. And here's my time lapse of me sawing out the fish shape. I don't really have a whole bunch to say. Sawing out the shape is always a very enjoyable and pretty straightforward step. Really all I can say is take your time, hold the saw in a really vertical position. That way you know exactly which part of the foam blank you are sawing into. And just run the blade just outside of your guideline, so that way you're less likely to cut too far. Once you've cut the shape out, and you'll see me do this just here in a second, is I'll get a sanding block and just work back the shape back to that guideline. So that way it's a real gradual, smooth transition, and you'll find a much even line and shape doing it this way. I have finished sawing out the board. Just checked a few measurements on the board and seen that it's pretty even, so line that up there. And as best I can on the top and bottom. And yeah, so right there was about 20.5, and ooh, pretty good. It's just 1 point. I know it's not everywhere, but looking pretty even, pretty good. I'm quite happy with that. Also, I'm happy that I haven't got any cuts into the board itself. Of course, this is the join here of the blanks, so there's going to be something there. I'm quite happy with that line, and I've learnt from my first board and any other previous boards, if you have a saw mark that goes past this line, you're going to have that mark left in the board when you're finished glassing and you know, the final job. I'm really happy how it's coming out. The join is looking solid and strong. I'm loving the shape. Well, the next thing you're about to see is me planing the board. So here's my planing footage, and unfortunately the battery died while recording this, so I have to use what I've got. Working on the underside always is easier with the planer. So you're planing along the outside of the board, and this means that the blade of the planer is always in contact with the board and makes some real nice clean cuts. So you can see in this first cut that I did along the stringer that the entire length of the board has been planed. Working with this surfboard, I had learned a lot. I wasn't as afraid of the planer anymore, as in the beginning, I had thought that planing meant that you were going to get a perfect outcome from the machine. However, later on I learned that that's not the case. You want to plane the board in long strokes, like what you can see here, to try getting as even as you can. But once you've finished a pass, so as you can see, I'm about to finish this first pass on the underside, I'm going to get out a sanding block, and I'm going to sand back that entire layer so that it's basically level again. Of course, you don't want to sand any individual spots to create any unevenness, but as long as you do nice big long strokes and circular sanding motions, you're going to get a pretty even finish on the board. When you get to planing, don't be afraid of running the machine on the board. You're going to get imperfections. Well, especially starting out, you want to take off a layer, get the sanding block out, work down the board so that it's nice and level before you get to your next cut. Also very important that you check the thickness of your board so that every time you run the planer and you take off another layer of foam, you are getting closer and closer to the desired thickness that you want, but you of course don't pass it and you make the board too thin. When I flip over the board, which you're just about to see here now, I'm going to work on the deck. Now this is where the battery died, unfortunately. And as you can see, I'm trying to work out the angle at which I should hold the planer. You cannot run the planer perfectly flat on the deck of the board. Because the nose curves upwards, it means that the flat base of the planer is not going to be in contact with the foam at all times. In order to get around this problem, you want to hold the planer at pretty much a 45-degree angle and run lengthways along the board, but having an angle so that the blade remains in contact with the board at all times. Just gonna run the time lapse and you'll see this first cut where I've got the planer sitting on an angle like so, and I'm running it along the board. And this more or less will get you a pretty even cut. Again, don't worry if you don't get a perfectly even plane every time. You're gonna be able to sand out these imperfections with your hand sand. Once I had the board at the desired thickness, it was time to put a single to double concave, and this was my very first time doing it. At first I tried using the sanding blocks and doing it by hand, but I really didn't get anywhere, and that join wasn't doing me any favors either. So out comes the planer, and I start from the stringer and work my way out, and this really made a great result. It definitely gave a nice smooth single concave there in the middle of the board, and after every pass, I'll get the sanding block out and just smooth out those cuts. So that came out really well. I move over to the tail now and I'll create that double concave. I did this completely by hand, and in hindsight, I could have used the planer again, but it worked out. It's a very subtle double concave, but definitely very similar to the surfboards I own, so I don't really see much of an issue there. Go online and have a look for guides and videos on concaves, as there are different types and different styles that one can do, and find the right type that's gonna suit the board that you wish to make. It's a very enjoyable step, and take your time with it. Keep looking at the board as you go and it will come out just fine. And here's my Railbands time lapse. I had totally forgotten to film myself drawing these lines out, as this was my very first time using them and I was just so preoccupied on getting it right. The Railband template I had used from a website called Greenlight. I will have the link below. And I followed their boxy Railbands template. Essentially, you're drawing guidelines in order to create 2 cuts along the rails. So the very first one's basically a 45-degree line running along the rails of the board. I'm using the planer because of that Q-cell join, just to give me a far even finish. Doing this by hand would have left that really big lump on that Q-cell, and I've had a lot of issues. Just cleaning up that first initial cut, and then basically now I'm going to go and measure out the board and create my second points. This dot, or this mark, is basically on the midpoint of the cut I just created. And I'm going to draw all these lines up together to get a nice flow and a nice line along the length of the board. And that way you have a much more even and gradual rail. So the second cut's about to begin here, which will create a sort of second step. Once you've got those 2 steps, you'll be able to then blend out the rail smoothly and get a nice rounded shape. In the past, I had left my boards far too boxy because I wasn't doing these rail bands, and I was quite nervous to go too far. But having a line and having these markers makes it a whole lot easier. Just remember to look at the board as a whole. The rail bands, of course, give you an indication where to cut, but you need to also kind of know what you're trying to achieve. And you need to just try to see where they sit with the board and that it all flows nice and evenly. You don't want any abrupt edges or ridges that don't make sense with the board. After that, I'm getting the template out and marking my fishtail or dovetail out. And because I couldn't help myself, I just wanted to cut that out now. The board's almost done, and now it's safe to have that fishtail there. So I am cutting that out now, and I'm just going to clean that up. So highly recommend doing rail bands. Really effective, really helpful in getting your rails right, and gives a far better finish. So here we are at our final step. After cutting the rail bands, I'm now just going to blend the whole board together. I've cut out the fishtail because I couldn't help myself, I needed to do it. So we got that fish look there. Hopefully it's all in the frame. I'm very happy with that. It feels really good. Once I've blended that through with all the gauze and the sanding blocks, I reckon it's going to come out really great. It's been challenging, that's for sure. Having to deal with this tougher Q-cell through the middle of the board and here on the rail has been a bit tricky. It's definitely not impossible, it's just made a bit of an extra challenge. Looking forward here to finishing off the tail. Got to blend the top a little bit more in. The bottom is staying pretty sharp, so don't need to worry too much there. And on the nose, so at the moment, that beak look that I've spoken about before, there's that beak look on the front, so I just need to get the planer, string planer, and cut that down. What do we actually technically call it? We call it a combi plane. That guy there, I'll just work my way down on the stringer just to get the nose a little bit rounder because I don't want to keep that thick. I want to have a really nice round nose. Yeah, what have I learnt with the rail bands? Don't be afraid of your planer. In the time lapse, you would have seen me use it for the rail bands. Had I not had this join, I would have just done it by hand completely. I've got the Q-cell, I had to hit it with the planer, so I got always a solid cut slice with the foam and the Q-cell. If I did it by hand, I would have had this bump that would have kept occurring and I wouldn't have been able to get through. So honestly, this join is actually challenged me in using the planer more, and I'm actually quite happy with that. Only thing I can maybe see is I feel like maybe there's a little bit too much volume in the nose because maybe I didn't plane that as much. Fish boards don't generally have a lot of volume in the chest area anyway, so I think that's not going to be an issue. The way it flows here into the tail, I'm quite happy with there, so not really too much to complain about. Let's get to it. I'm really keen to finish this board off today. So enjoy the following time lapse. So I finally finished blending out the board, blended the rails, those steps I had, did the nose, did the tail, and yeah, just a quick little wrap up, show you what it looks like. I'm gonna grab my GoPro here, and I'm gonna get that rolling, jump onto the GoPro. Boop. Okay, so yeah, really happy with the outcome. I've got that real subtle bulge just there, and you can subtly feel it, which is really tricky to work with, but look, I'm going to accept that. It's a quirk in the board, and that's how it is. Doing the rail bands, really, really good. I've got a way better rail shape than what I've previously done before. Not as boxy, definitely blends far better there. Not perfect, but it's really center. That stringer is smack bang in the middle. Try not getting in the light. And actually feels really good, so that's lovely. Working my way back down to the tail. Now, I didn't have a really good file to work the stringer back, so it's a bit bulgy. I mean, I'm going to accept it as a quirk. The more I try working with it, the more I affect the tail either side, and I just don't really want to ruin what I'm happy with there. So look, I'm just going to accept that as a quirk. That's just how it is now. In the future, I can probably get a better file, something a bit more coarser, and also will be able to get in there. Just wants to flip the board over. It's always really tricky to show the contours, but I will do my best with the GoPro here. This is the first board I've put a contour onto, so I'm actually quite happy with the result. Starting the nose, pretty flat, and actually might have accidentally done a bit of a V if I'm getting really nitpicky. It's basically flat. Starting to work through here up, we'll see that single concave begin. It's actually quite sudden. There it is. Single concave. Gonna keep on moving through. About there would be about the peak of the concave. There's that Q-cell join, and it's gonna start easing out. Now it's gonna start going into that double. I'll do my best to capture that again for you guys. So back. Stringer's coming up, and I got a very subtle double here approaching. It's a bit more pronounced further back there. Now, really subtle. I probably could have gone a little harder, and then flat out into the tail. it is there. There is a double concave. Very subtle. Pretty happy with that. So yeah, switch off the GoPro. Back here again. My join, the dowlings that I used, looking back on reflection, I probably should have used a dowling that wasn't as thick. So this one, the diameter is too large. I should have used a thinner one. So if you're going to do this project, choose a thinner, just a standard, I think like 8mm dowling or so. 10mm was too much. I shouldn't have done that. It was a bit of a, thought I'd introduce strength, but it was just harder to drive the dowling through, even with the pre-drilled holes. So stick to the thinner dowling and also make it a bit longer. It worked well just to guide the two halves together. So I'm not really complaining. Most of the strength is going to be in that Q-cell and the glass layer once the board's fiberglass. What I like about the board, really happy with the shape. I actually don't mind the tail so much, just that bit in the stringer. I think it's going to go good. Previously stated, I think there's a bit more volume in the nose than probably required. Actually, I don't feel there's too much to say bad. Pretty happy with it. Don't really have anything I'm totally opposed at all. So this is the end of my shaping the fish video. Going forward, I will color the board in how I've done it before. So I'll make a video doing that, and then of course glassing the board. So this is the end of shaping. Try getting this out as soon as I can. Thank you very much for watching if you made it this far, and I hope to see you all again soon. Thanks so much. You.